Welcome back for our fifth Acknowledging and Confronting Our History Clergy Conversations. I'm Chris Jason, and I'll be facilitating again today. And we will move on to a more recent time, the 80s and 90s. So I'll go ahead and share my screen with you all. So this time period, I'm entitling Multiculturalism for the 80s and the 90s. So the first question, or actually the concept for this one is anti-racism. So a famous quote by Angela Davis that many of you may have heard of by now: "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." So we'll be looking at that term or that quote a little bit later this morning. So the first question looks at a popular sporting story we all know. So the 1961 point shaving scandals led to recruiting restrictions that Dean Smith inherited, which forced him to rely on homegrown talent. Consider the implications of this in-state strategy and its impact on discovering hidden gems like Michael Jordan. So when thinking about the 80s and 90s, especially at the beginning of the 80s, I'd be remiss to not talk about Michael Jordan coming to Chapel Hill in 1981 officially. So his earliest recruitment is probably more well known due to the more recent series that came out, but just wanted to give some information about that for people who may not be aware. So the first thing is that his family spent at least 6 generations in Wilmington or near Wilmington, on or around Highway 117. And it's kind of ironic tied to our information about the 1898 Wilmington Massacre and insurrection. So even though that was the first successful coup d'etat in American history, out of that same community, a few generations later, came one of the most recognized celebrities and definitely Black celebrities in the world. So Bob Gibbons, then a young recruiting writer from Lenore, North Carolina, was introduced to Jordan in the summer of 1979. Bobby Crimmins was then a coach at Appalachian State, and he had the Laney team up at his camp in the mountains and wanted him to meet Gibbons. And so Jordan had not even played for the Laney varsity team yet. And what impressed both of Bob and Bobby was that Jordan was really interested in getting better. He wanted to find out how to continue to improve. And so Gibbons was not very well known at the time, which would change in about a year. So Jordan was able to fly under the radar, surprisingly, even as a junior, averaging 25 points for the Laney team, for a powerful 4A team. And he somehow went unnoticed, except for North Carolina, by the big four powers in the state. Part of that, for people who may remember this time, which was a little before some of our time, is that Bill Foster and at Duke and Norman Sloan at State, they were in their final seasons. Mike Krzyzewski and Jim Valvano, they were late in the game to pursue Jordan because they were still at Army and Iona. So Bill Guthridge was able to be the first to see him play at Laney High School. So with recruiting North Carolina, a lot of people know about the in-state strategy, but don't recognize some of the conditions for what led to it. And so it was a priority for Dean Smith, who replaced Frank McGuire as head coach in summer of '61. And McGuire preferred to build his team around his pipeline from the New York City area. But recruiting restrictions that Smith inherited resulted in the university's de-emphasis on basketball after the 1961 point shaving scandals that forced Smith to rely heavily on homegrown talent to rebuild. So Guthridge made the trip to North Carolina coast after receiving a tip from the athletic director for the New Hoover County Schools, Mike Brown. And he definitely thought that he was quick and had great hands, but he calls him unmilked, which is a famous quote now about Jordan at that time frame. And so basically, a young assistant, Roy Williams, was assigned to call and write Jordan and try to get him to the summer camp that summer. And of course, Coach Smith wanted to keep him quiet or secret, because it was a time whenever you could mention recruits in interviews, but he wanted to keep that under the radar. Williams did make one exception, though, by calling a friend, Brett Oettinger, who in his third year of covering basketball recruiting for a publication known as the Poop Sheet. So in that, Roy told him to keep it secret. And so Oettinger actually checked the schedule for Laney and saw that they would be playing the defending 4A champion Southern Wayne High School, and decided to check out the game with a few friends. Laney goes on to win the game by 20 points, being up by 30 at one point. And in his next issue of February 1980, he basically quotes, "You probably haven't heard the name Mike Jordan, but he has the best combination of athleticism, basketball skills, and intangibles of any high school wing I've ever seen." A personal connection to that game for me, being from that part of the state. Um, that game versus Southern Wayne included my mom's younger sister, Aunt Stephanie, who was a cheerleader, and then my dad's first cousin, Mike Frederick, who was a guard on the Southern Wayne team. So it's kind of cool to see that connection with the icon of Michael Jordan. The next question is that former Chancellor Paul Hardin III initially preferred a multicultural center over a Black cultural center on campus. What are some creative ways to help move beyond racial status quos in our local community? So in this Black Cultural Center fight, this actually spans both the 80s and 90s, and I wanted to start by this idea of the limits of the multicultural paradigm. It's often used, multiculturalism is often used interchangeably with the ever expanding term diversity, which is including all types of difference. And instead of creating radically new paradigms that ensure justice, multicultural reforms are routinely sucked back into the system. And this comes from an article by Gloria Latson Billings and Bill Tate called Towards a Critical Race Theory of Education. It comes out in the mid-90s. And they basically unabashedly reject a paradigm that attempts to be everything to everyone and consequently becomes nothing for anyone, allowing the status quo to prevail. So in 1984, a physical space for Black students was first proposed. 4 years later, this cultural center was opened and the student union was temporarily located in a renovated snack bar. 3 years later, in 1991, Sonia Stone passes away suddenly of a stroke, and so the students in the community decide they want her name to be the namesake. The next year, Hardin suggests a multicultural center. He'd rather have a forum, not a fortress. Yanni Chapman does a really great, one of the first analysis of race in the university's history in the, I think, 2006, and he basically introduces this concept of diversity without justice. So we'll come back to that term as well. In July of 92, 4 football players, John Bradley, Tim Smith, Jimmy Hitchcock, and Malcolm Marshall, found the Black Awareness Council, and they get national attention a few months later in September in the New York Times, an article written by Bill Rhoden, who's the author of $40 Million Slaves, where he talks about 12 football players who led 300 students to Hardin's office. A week later, due to the national attention, Spike Lee and Khalid Muhammad, they visit the Dean Smith Center, and he speaks about 5,000 students. And Lee in particular urged more Black students to sit games. That pressure eventually, of course, leads to the very next month after a University Day protest for Hardin to agree with the idea. And then the next year, during the 200th centennial of the university's founding, Trustee Angela Bryant talks about the symbolic nature of the Black Cultural Center, but wasn't sure if the Board of Trustees, her fellow trustees, could or wanted to understand that. And then Harry Amana, a distinguished professor in the journalism school, he talks about throwing a 200th birthday party and celebrating 200 years of what, whenever we're still on the outside looking in, referring to African Americans. In 1999, as the 2 decades come to an end, a $26 million unrestricted request by an alum who passed was given, and Michael Hooker, before he passes away, wants a good bit of that money to go to the unfinished Stone Center. Hardin, a few years later, I think right after the opening of the center, made a quote that was pretty interesting. He said that we need to keep helping minorities understand that the center was not to be a space of Black self-segregation. And then our third question, issues like residential segregation impact equal access to education, public resources, and employment. How might we move beyond addressing these issues piecemeal? So at the end of the 90s, the Chapel Hill Carrboro City School System starts to attack the achievement gap. Actually, in 1999, the Minority Student Achievement Network was formed. It was initially created of superintendents of 15, mostly suburban school districts that were invited to attend a meeting at the American Association of School Administrators at a conference in New Orleans. They shared small to moderate size enrollments. They were suburban, diverse, recognized public and published achievement gaps by race and ethnicity. They were well-resourced financially and had strong relationships with one or more institutions of higher education in their community. A number of these school districts were located in university communities such as Amherst, Massachusetts, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Berkeley, California, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Chapel Hill, of course, Evanston, Illinois, and Madison, Wisconsin. The organization's major purpose is to discover, investigate, and implement principles and practices likely to take race and ethnicity out of the student achievement equation. The thinking of the superintendents was that their organization should be able to set a research agenda and collaborate with scholars who would share those interests. And if they could not make substantial progress given their commitments, their resources, and the help of renowned scholars, what school district could was the thought. And as we're discovering with our approach to technology and confronting our local racial history, it is not a surprise that this research agenda approach has failed because the other 14 locations have their own unique histories. Even as a first-year teacher at Chapel High School for myself, I was put on the equity team. And at 23 years old, I could even see the mismatch in solutions as a young professional. 1 year prior to our Board of Governors ending the UNC Center for Law, UNC Law's Center for Civil Rights Litigation Ability, they published a State of Exclusion in Orange County report. It was an in-depth analysis of the legacy of segregated communities. Residential segregation also undermines equal access to education, public resources, and employment. And despite this understanding, most advocates address these issues piecemeal. Housing segregation operates at a neighborhood level, and when a neighborhood is overwhelmingly one race, all the residents face impacts of that segregation regardless of their own race or circumstances. And this report looked at North Carolina as a case study. The impacts tied to supermajority non-white neighborhoods called excluded communities. And the term excluded applied socially, politically, or economically from opportunities available to other residents. One particular form of exclusion is a phenomenon of municipal underbounding. And underbounding occurs when a municipality's limits do not include a neighborhood that would otherwise be within the municipal limits based upon its location, density, and history. Underbounding sometimes is obvious. A Black neighborhood may completely be surrounded by municipal limits, but not included, which is a donut hole. In other cases, it's not immediately apparent, and the community may be near but not directly adjacent to a municipality, but still underbounding based on social and historical context. And I also wanted to reference a mentor, Harold Wallace. He was the first associate dean serving Black students and the first Black vice chancellor of the university. He was a mentor of mine that taught me that almost every asset of UNC's Black life, as well as the town, came from student pressure or young adults in the community. So those are some of the background to these questions, and I'll go back to our initial or our quote for the session. So it's about the idea of anti-racism. And Angela Davis says that in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. So I'd love to get you all's thoughts about that quote, especially as it relates to the other 4 definitions that we talked about leading up to this point of individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. So feel free to respond to any of those as it relates to anti-racism.
Would you repeat that quote, please, about change coming from pressure from the community or pressure from the student body? And who said that?
Yes, for sure. So Harold Wallace, he was the first associate dean for the university serving Black students in 72 or 73, and the first Black vice chancellor of the university who oversaw minority affairs in 1980. And he basically said that every facet of UNC's Black life, and also for the community's Black life as well, came from either Black student pressure or Black young people in the community fighting for those advancements.
That leaves the rest of us in a less than brilliant light, I suspect. You know, Ibram Kendi, that quote leaves the rest of us who are not members of those 2 groups in less than a shining light, and shows our failure to bring these changes about, to bring about justice, which we believe in, to be effective in doing that. Ibram Kendi makes a point in his most recent book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, much as Angela Davis did, it's not enough simply to be not racist. Progress is not made that way. It maintains the status quo. Kendi goes on further to say that that leaders in the movement should be judged by their by their effectiveness, not by what they say, but by what they accomplish. Um, and I think it leads us to ponder, can the faith community, composed largely of white, not young adult members, what can we do to be effective? What can we do to bring about change and be effective change agents as anti-racists? And I think that's our challenge. And I still struggle to find those answers.
I agree, Wes. One of the things that has stood out to me in reflecting on the passing of John Lewis was that in '61, the Freedom Rides, he was only 21 when he spoke at the March on Washington in '63, 23, and then walking the bridge in Selma in '65, 25 years old. And that's really striking to me, and also challenging to all of us of what voices are we listening to and what space are we making for young people in the community to lead us and to lead the way here.
There's the thing about being non-racist and anti-racist. So in Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to the Birmingham jail, one way to think about it is the folks that he was writing to, which is primarily a group who would say that they are on the more progressive side and are non-racists. Most of the folks who he was writing to would say, I'm a non-racist. But the letter was about how to be an anti-racist. And I think that's a distinction we might want to consider.
Justin, I'm glad you mentioned that because I didn't say that in my background, but so former Chancellor Hardin, I know passed through about 3 years ago, and I came to that service just because I know he had done a lot of great things for the community. But one of the things that was interesting about his connection to that letter is that his father, was one of the 8 clergy that MLK is responding to, and when he would often mention that during the Stone Center controversy as thinking it was a good thing, not catching, what you were saying, kind of the critique that MLK was making of these clergy. So I found that interesting, that, you want to be associated with this great figure, but not realizing that he's basically kind of giving you, not giving you the best of marks, if you will. So I just wanted to offer that as well.
Thank you for that. And I was going to mention that when we get to our second question. I'll go into it a little bit more. But yes, Paul Hardin was a member of our church, and I was one of the clergy presiding at his memorial service. But one of his, in my first conversations, was about how his father was a United Methodist bishop who was one of the folks that Dr. King wrote the letter to. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but Paul also had reflections about how he felt that his response differed from his father's. And so as we get to question 2, it might be interesting to come back to that.
Any other thoughts about non-racist versus anti-racist? And if you don't have any right now, you can feel free to bring them up as we go through.
Well, I would just say that I think part of why the white ministers who received Dr. King's letter in Birmingham would call, we're so silent. I mean, that was part of his critique. Your silence isn't helping, but they would justify their silence by saying that they weren't racist individually, which I think led them into a passive stance of accepting structural inequities and injustices that Dr. King wanted to see changed. And so I think that's a defining feature of being non-racist. It is a passive stance of silent acceptance of the way things are, and rather to be anti-racist is a much more active posture of using one's voice, whether one is white or black, or regardless of one's cultural background or lived experience, but using one's voice, and not accepting the status quo, but rather exercising judgments about what account for racist positions or racist policies, and really focusing on the impact of one's words and the policies that are passed, or the political opinions that prevail. So I think it's a distinction between being silent and using one's voice, and between being passive and being active.
I'm really struck, Chris, by how much of what you've reported so far today had to do with the university. And so I'm a pastor in Chapel Hill, but not directly connected to the university, even though, as you pointed out in the first conversation, the town was created largely to support the university. So I'm finding myself feeling challenged about what is my place, if any, in response to what happens at the university. As an Episcopal priest, we have the Chapel of the Cross, which is right there on the campus, and I think of them as being the university connection. But the university and the town are interdigitated, right? So I don't know. And then even if I wanted to get involved in the university, I don't know what the first step would be, or how do I hear or learn what's going on that's unjust or racist that I can respond to. So I tend to think of my work more in North Chapel Hill and relationships with the Rogers Road community, or, as I've said each time, with the affordable housing needs, and the Pee Wee homes and provision of housing in Northside and all that. So I just feel challenged, and I don't know what the answer is.
And I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that I've come to understand as I've become more of a student of this community being here is that what you mentioned is really important. Like, there's really even Rogers Road, will come back to that with the last question. Like, that's a huge piece of the neglect, and they're an underbounded community, like as I referenced from the Center for Civil Rights report. But starting back with the question with Dean Smith and Michael Jordan, I just thought it was helpful. Like, for one, even though the university is technically its own structure, like clearly, sports, particularly basketball, particularly, Dean Smith, and when Michael Jordan comes along, that permeates the entire community, right? And like even Michael said previously with like our first player, whose name I'm blanking on, I can't believe, basically spent time in Durham and other places because, thank you. And I saw the face, but the name wasn't coming to me. So, so I think that there is, you are, and others are probably doing more than you realize, because they are so interwoven. And so I know some people probably knew about the context for why Dean became an in-state person, but what are people's thoughts about this idea of mining local talent, particularly, Wilmington with its sordid past, with the massacre and insurrection being part of the history of that community. So are there any thoughts about that for people mining local talent or talent within the community?
Yes. There was a player, Dean Smith had an unofficial rule. It was called the Cedric Maxwell rule. They missed out on a player from Kinston, Cedric Maxwell, cornbread. He went to the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, went to the NCAA Final Four. If you research him, the reason I know so much about him, I went to seminary in Boston, and he was drafted by the Celtics. And he would torch the league. He was something. And so that was a player that they really did not look at, but they made a mistake, and the staff said they would never make that mistake again of overlooking ingrown talent. And so Cedric Maxwell, cornbread. Read about him. You would see that's part of the reason why they knew there was talent in North Carolina, from James Worthy to Sleepy Floyd, who played at Georgetown. There was a lot of talent here. And so instead of going out with Frank McGuire, who had the pipeline to New York, there were players down south that were just as capable. And so now getting back to your races and I mean your non-racist and anti-racist, I think we all have a bias. I think anti-racist deals with the fact we got to acknowledge our own bias in order to move in that direction of where we free ourselves from that to be anti-racist, because we all have a bias. Let's be truthful. I mean, that's the first part of it, of being truthful. And I think that's a truthful statement that Angela Davis makes of being non-racist. We can easily hide under that label, I'm non-racist, but we fail to acknowledge the bias that we have to deal with secretly, and to expose it and to address it, which will help us to see the need of being anti-racist. So that's my sermon for this morning.
I hate to admit ignorance again, but what was the point shaving scandal in 1961? Can you sum it up in just a sentence or two?
Would anyone else like the honor of that before I try to do so? Who knows a little bit about it?
Do it, Michael.
No, I would prefer someone else to speak. My father was a basketball person, and I'm
So basically, it was there had been a similar one 10 years prior to where organized crime tends to find its way into sports, and there was a way to try to throw games for the bookies and the people that were betting on games. And one of our stars, Doug Mo, I believe is the name, got caught in the implication of it. I think he met with someone but never actually accepted it. But because it was such a widespread thing around the country, that a lot of universities, including ours, kind of step back a little bit from trying to be caught up in the ways that organized crime tends to be involved with sports and betting. So that's basically kind of the gist of it. But we weren't really super, but I think it was good for, especially some of us weren't around, for a lot of this. So the way people talk fondly about, Dean Smith being an in-state person, but like Michael said, I think I've heard of the cornbread player, but there were circumstances that led to these strategies as opposed to just being, the strategy. Even, mentioning just talking a little bit last week about, the secret games between Central and Duke, and, the fact that HBCUs actually were winning these games. And, that's a lot of the history that's not included, as well as even, the Four Corners. I just found out from a mentor that's in Rocky Mount that it actually, Dean Smith says in his book, he got it from, I think the Central coach actually. It wasn't, but a lot of us, we say that it was Dean Smith because that's what people go off of what they know was popular as opposed to where it actually began. But that's a great question, Lisa.
Well, was the restriction that was placed on Dean Smith given from the NCAA or from the university, or who told him he had to go with local talent?
The university primarily did. I'm sure the NCAA has some guidance as well, but it was more of a reaction from the university to do so. And then as well as, Michael mentioned too, there were some other players I didn't reference because just for time's sake that we lost to other teams. David Thompson being a great example, who was a model or a role model for Michael Jordan. And so, but it was more of an imposed from the institution.
My understanding that when Dean Smith was brought on board initially as coach, it was in an attempt to try to decrease the importance of sports on the campus. There was no one envisioned what a extraordinary coach he was. They just thought, well, we'll just rock along. We won't be famous. We won't be great. And that's fine with us. That would be our preference. Actually, let's hire this math teacher to coach our basketball team.
Chris, I have a question. I love basketball as much as anybody, but I don't understand how the conversation about basketball relates to being an anti-racist.
So it's basically about the local history piece of the 80s and the 90s. And when you look at the beginning of the 80s, Michael Jordan as an African American player coming to the community is noteworthy. And also, just to clarify, the principles are more so for conversation. They're not directly tied to the information. They're not each of the definitions don't completely tie to the content, because that's a little tough to do. They're all somewhat connected, but it's not meant to be a direct connection. It's more so for conversation.
But the reason I asked the question is advancement of African Americans in sports is not about advancement of African Americans in society. If coaches think that someone's going to help them win, I mean, coaches are about winning. So if they find players that are going to help them win, they're going to bring those players on and elevate those players. But I don't see how it elevates the non-athlete.
Any other thoughts, Kurt?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about this. Actually, it came up in my mind when you all, and we all do this, we use the metaphor of mining the state for local talent. And I grew up in Eastern Kentucky in coal mining country. And generally what happens is that when the resource is mined from a local community, the benefits, the proceeds, the other resources generally leave the local community and don't come back. Generally, the resources then farmed out somewhere else, or the folks who own the mineral rights are not actually from that area. And so just thinking about the ways that if local talent is mined, what is that doing to that local community? And maybe there are instances where a specific community, maybe receives some benefits because an athlete, to use this example, comes back home and brings resources maybe. But if the kind of all of the Black athletes and, this example, for instance, are brought in and then they're used for their gain is used to bring about money, other resources to a university, how is it impacting them, their communities? How's it going? And is it are those resources being shared across, communities and wherever it's coming from individual, those sorts of things. So it just made me think about how we, at least in my understanding, the mining analogy does not shed like a positive light on what happens to those who are mined.
And I would ask a follow-up question with what Kurt said. How many of the elite Black athletes themselves become anti-racists, or how many of them become a part of the elite and wealthy in society that leave the poor behind? Once they've been mined and gotten out of their communities.
Well, I don't feel very qualified to comment on the domain of sports that we're talking about, but the working analogy of mining, the community or the talent wherever it comes from, really raises in my mind the question of how sports can be exploitative of talent, especially of African American talent, so that I think Michael Jordan is an example of a sort of a rare example, a Steve Jobs sort of person, sort of a rising star who finds success. And I don't have a whole lot of data to back this up, but I think my general understanding is that most athletes don't achieve that level of success, and many college athletes, are kind of part of this sports system that use their name, their likeness, their talent, and their abilities to drive revenues for their schools, and don't have the life outcomes of a Michael Jordan. And so I'm not sure where that fits into this conversation, but it seems to me like a relevant subject along the lines of um, uh, what is racist and anti-racist in our consumption of sports, and in what it means for us to be part of a community that is so organized, like Chapel Hill is, around college athletics.
Well, our society in general has not treated outspoken Black athletes kindly,
Mm-hmm.
and that has been present since the very first. The kind of abuse that Willie Mays took, understanding that he really couldn't say anything about it, was the imposition that was placed on him. Certainly the Olympics, and I can't remember what year it was, where there was the specter of protest was raised by Black athletes. They were roundly criticized. And even more recently, we've seen how outspoken Black athletes who have knelt during the national anthem as a protest against the loss of Black lives have not been treated well.
That was the Olympics of 1968.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
A great awakening. My mother and father were Black history instructors, so that was a time of great awakening. I mean, for the question, getting back to the question, why are we using basketball? In the sense that, for years prior to Michael Jordan arriving, there was hesitancy for your elite basketball players to really look at North Carolina for the fact of the system that they employed, in terms of having to play within a regimented system. And for years, they did not take transfers, but one came in, McAdoo, and really elevated, was really a part of that elevated the program, which gives recognition that there are those that dream to play for those D1 programs, and to see others who are there of the similar shade as you being utilized and given an opportunity. I think that adds credence to that question in terms of the significance of basketball, which was used as a vehicle for a lot of our families to really have access to education and to further themselves in terms of their career. I have a very good friend who played on the team at Carolina from 83 to about 85, was a walk-on, but used that to go to medical school. Now, who's a cardiologist in Richmond, Virginia. But he talks about how he had an opportunity to go other places, but Carolina presented the opportunity to the program as well as to, name recognition. So that, basketball has been, unfortunately, it's been good, but it's also been detrimental. So it's how we utilize it.
But it doesn't address the vast majority of African American students who aren't basketball players, or if they are, they're not going to get recruited to Carolina or State. I mean, that's being an elite athlete. What about the 90% who want to be doctors or lawyers? Or, I mean, you might use the example of how basketball helped the one become a doctor. But what about the ones who can't dunk and are only 5'7" and want to be a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor or a vet or whatever? I I don't see how the elite athlete lifts up those unless the elite athlete uses his voice. And Michael Jordan, once he became the icon for Nike, he specifically shied away from making social statements. And when Nike was called on the carpet for using child labor in Vietnam and Cambodia, he didn't say a word except that Republicans buy sneakers too. I mean, that's his famous quote from the early 90s when he became Air Jordan. He's become more outspoken recently, but I can't remember who made the point about black athletes being punished, Wes, I think, for speaking out and suffering consequences. Muhammad Ali had to give up his title when he was opposed to the Vietnam War. So I think being an anti-racist is a pretty complicated thing.
Yeah. I mean, Robert, I think your point is well taken, and it's and I think we mentioned in one of our sessions before. I mean, I've got great concern around how, in various iterations of our history, and we've even seen it in this conversation, that black bodies are used for economic gain. And then, as Kurt has reminded us in chat, like, somebody will say to LeBron, once he starts speaking up, shut up and dribble, right? And so, help to earn some money, but stay quiet. How often have we heard that in various iterations across history? And, it's also troubling that, on average, African Americans are leaders in media consumption, or leaders in consumption. So, make us money, and then the money you make, give back quickly. And so, Jordans are expensive, and folks who are making them absolutely expect that they will be purchased at a higher rate by people who cannot afford them. I mean, there's just all kinds of injustice built into this. And then, as it relates to, when someone who's an athlete or, or somebody else, makes it big, is able to move out of the community, create a quote unquote better life for themselves, how do they give back? I mean, my father, who passed away years ago, just had this sense that, he always wanted his children to do well, but he felt like it was an absolute responsibility to find some kind of way to give back. He became a community investment banker, VP at a national bank, and his goal in life was to help to offer loans for minority business. And it was part of, this responsibility he felt to helping to improve the quality of life in the Black community in whatever way, to empower the Black community in whatever way. And some folks carry that sense of a responsibility, and some folks don't. I mean, that is, to me, I think this is, rather than use language of anti-racist, I'd use the language of, how can you continue to be for justice as you have greater economic and or political capacities. And this is where, again, the witness of John Lewis should teach us something, as someone who remained dedicated to that, no matter what capacities he developed to live and flourish in this world.
And I wanted to quickly say, I'm glad that I didn't foresee the conversation going in this direction, which I'm glad it did, because you all are hitting on lots of things that need to be talked about. And a couple of quick things. So Michael Jordan's, the critique about what he was or wasn't able to do, I think some of you might remember in his Hall of Fame speech, he basically reveals how he was basically told that he couldn't say some of the things, or take stances on some of the things. And that we can all speculate about whether or not he should have. But the point is that he was, from what I understand, he was systematically silenced for that very reason. And another thing too, that some of you may remember, but just to give some more context about why he became who he did at the time frame, from 77 to 79, in the beginning of his high school time, Sonny Vaccaro starts the first shoe contract with Nike. And by 79, it really starts to become popular. And then in that same year, two other important things happen that lead this context for a Jordan to basically emerge and turn this into a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's the NCAA championship of where Magic and Larry Bird play each other, right? It's kind of black versus white player. And then you also have ESPN being founded that same year. So those were some of the seeds that led to Michael Jordan being able to enter into a time where the commercialization really took off, probably like no other time. So I like that Justin mentioned and Michael earlier, like it's not always, it's the fact that Rob even asked the question about what about the other black students is really important, because that's really what we need to ask about. Everyone, and sadly, that's the main example that we see in a lot of our communities is either sports or entertainment. But it's not necessarily because, again, if you think about my mentor, Generate McNeil History says, look at the way that Black labor is addressed, often exploited. And so those are the ways in which you are exploited most for the gain of the country. And that's why people are having a hard time with college athletes being paid. But it's basically the train is out of the station at this point, especially with the NBA starting to pay high schoolers. I think the top 30 high schoolers can make as much as $500,000. So there's no way we're going to come back from that. So I'm glad that all of these different conversations have kind of sprung from that question. I think we already kind of hit the racial status quo question too. So I think Michael is going to share something as well.
I'm fine.
I want to, I'm not really a sports person, so this is kind of took a different track with this, and my reflection was I was assuming the standard prior to Dean Smith coming was a top level basketball team, drew the best people from all over the country. And this infraction caused that to not be possible. And that changing of that standard birthed the career of Michael Jordan. So my thought was the question was, what status quo standards are excluding people now that we don't see? And that kind of, to me, gets to the question of, what about that star history student who's out there that we're not seeing, or star political science student that we're not seeing? Because we have these standards that seem, potentially, I guess, drawing candidates from all across the country is a very inclusive thing. But is it really inclusive in how it's being practiced?
Yeah, and that gets back to the statistic that Chris gave us a week or two or three ago about the number of African American males who are enrolled at UNC undergrad, and that included the athletes. It's like, wow. You said that number has improved, but still, and that doesn't count graduate students and everything else.
Yeah, and Matt brought that up, which I appreciate, again, like looking at racist policy and admission. And, one of the things that, I think we've kind of stumbled upon, especially you all have stumbled upon, is like when we think about the way that racism and then anti-racism looks in a community like a university community, what we're talking about is that very thing. Because for Rob to ask the question, I appreciate that question, but, I don't want to speak for anyone else on the call, but just like when you're a Black male, I mean, I experienced that as a student. The question was, what sport do you play? It wasn't, and I didn't play any sports, so, and if there's an assumption that, and it's okay if we did, like Michael said, that was a way that some people utilize that as a means, but there's a lot of, back to someone else mentioning bias, I think it might've been Wes, or Michael and Wes, like, there's just a lot of bias, and what we're going through now is helping to kind of, as a first pass, like help people start to understand that when you do see, an athletic looking person of color, particularly a Black person, especially a Black male, don't assume that they played sports or that they do play sports, because that's, as Jada said, he's not a sports. Some of us aren't sports people. Like there's just there's a lot wrapped into this. And I think that, the racial status quos of our community, are something to think about, especially when it comes to, someone, I don't remember mentioned it earlier, right in the very beginning, it might have been Cameron or someone talking about how whiteness hides itself. Ask that question, like within your own, communities of faith, or like your social circles, like where do you not see difference, and start to find out, why do you not see difference? Is it because, people just don't want to be in the space, or because we haven't invited them to the space, or we don't think that they deserve to be in the space? And then, so one quick question, one quick thing I wanted to throw into, and feel free to respond to anything that, is on your heart, but as it really, I know Justin's helped to bring us into this conversation about the achievement gap several times, which is important. But when we think about, the fact that a lot of our issues as it relates to local racial history and the legacy of it are interrelated, right? So like residential segregation in particular, housing segregation, as Lisa mentioned, that's really the core of a lot of the problems. So it impacts equal access to education, public resources, employment. So how do we start to, or some of us may have already been involved in this, I don't want to make assumptions, but how can we, as a group here, think about moving beyond addressing these issues in piecemeal? Because the school district is never going to figure it out by themselves, because they don't set housing policy and transportation and the way the university impacts the town. So what are some ways that you think, and at least I think you're, again, to your point, you're actually impacting the town and the university more than you realize, because residential housing segregation is a really big piece of both of the communities that cause a lot of the discrimination to continue to persist. So just love to hear y'all's thoughts on that, how we can do it in a more coordinated way, and definitely some others who I haven't heard from, if you'd be willing to offer some thoughts.
Can I say one more thing before we move from the previous point? And I did want to bring up Paul Hardin just once more to just talk about this, what it means to be a non-racist and an anti-racist. So, and I just hasten to say that Paul is one of the folks that I credit for being in the role I'm in today, because when I was a Duke Divinity School student intern, I had some strong feelings about how something should be done, and Paul had noted my practice and wrote me a longish email critiquing my practice. To which I wrote him an even longer email defending it. Young, brash, newly minted, all right. He'd been the president of my undergraduate institution, had been before I was there, and then I'd known that he was a chancellor here, and I just still decided to, and he was sufficiently impressed by the correspondence that he wrote, saying that I should be appointed here as an associate pastor out of seminary, and that directly led to me coming back as a senior pastor. So I appreciate Paul and his advocacy there. When he talks about his father, he felt like his father was far too gradualist, and that and Paul seemed to be very concerned with integrated life. And so I do wonder, so there's a way in which that he was pushing back on the Black Cultural Center, because in his mind he thought that this work was moving toward anti-racism. I mean, multiculturalism was moving toward anti-racism. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, because I think mixed feelings then emerge about, well, I know you're trying to be, anti-racist. I mean, but in all actuality, what you're doing might not be the preferred way to be anti-racist. And so, I mean, I think there's another layer of our conversation. I mean, yeah, I want to be anti-racist, but I don't always know how to be anti-racist in a way that is most supportive of the African American community. Because I just, I believe to the core that Paul, if he were able to sit next to me today, would say, "Look, I've just been trying to be anti-racist because of what I learned of my father and Dr. King's interactions."
Thanks for
I
that.
wrestle with some of ththese tensions a lot as the pastor of a church that wants to be growing in diversity. I and has in many ways grown as a more diverse congregation in recent years. Um, uh, I have found the language of multiculturalism, or I've really embraced the language of multiculturalism in my own congregation, because there are so many different identities um, in our midst, of which we want to be inclusive. The African American experience, perhaps the largest group that's growing in our own congregation because of a bilingual worship service that we have, is the Latinx community. We also want to be a congregation that's very affirming and embracing of the LGBTQ community and queer people and all of their identities. What I hear in the distinction between the Black Cultural Center and the language of multiculturalism is rather that there's power in particularity, and that we should create spaces where or we should aim to create spaces where people can be themselves, where they can relate to others who share their lived experience. And because when we sort of obviate that kind of particularity, then I think, as Chris said, the status quo prevails when we are nothing to anyone. So I really have struggled with this quite a lot in my present role, because on the one hand, we are a white church with such a white history, and on the other hand, we have so much diversity that is growing up among us, and we have this deep yearning and desire to be sort of this rainbow community where all people flourish and where all people can find something. And yet, I think it's quite impossible for us to create spaces where everybody can find what they want, and where all identities can flourish equally. So I'm really interested in this conversation. I don't really have any conclusions around it, except to name that this is something that I really wrestle with in my current position. I don't think that it's just like the Black Cultural Center, where African Americans have found on college campuses that they need a place that is particularly their own. But in the landscape of American religion, especially American Protestantism, that is the Black church experience. And there's very little in my own church or congregation that has the power to satisfy that for those who need the Black church experience in their own practices of worship. So our desire to grow in anti-racism and in diversity is, I think, in tension with that need for particularity. As the pastor of a historically white church, it's not my job to ask Black people to worship here or to create a church that is growing in that sort of diversity. But rather, I think it is my position or my responsibility to help my own congregation grow in its abilities to be anti-racist, in adopting a more active stance when it sees injustice, and then developing some habits and some practices that can make us a more inclusive, welcoming, and affirming community to whoever might find themselves here. those are just a few words about how I've kind of wrestled with these things, and I found that there are very few places where I'm able to talk about it, and so I'm really grateful for the chance to be in conversation with all of you about this.
Lisa, did you have something you were gonna share? You're still muted. I'm sorry.
Mine is more to note sort of two topics that I'd love to bring to this conversation at some point. If not, we have one more session, is that right? Or is this the last one? You're muted this time.
I'm sorry. We've got a couple more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to flag the whole Durham Chapel Hill thing and how there's this I would call arrogance in Chapel Hill towards Durham, and how much of that is racially based, and fear of people from Durham coming over, or judgment, or whatever. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, back on the sort of the anti-racism question, is how much do we judge people by how they dress, and how much pressure is on people of color to dress a certain way in order not to be judged as people of color? And that by that I also include hairstyles and everything else. And I just want to tag those two things. It's a bit off track, but I want to tag them for Chris. Thank you.
I'd like to say that I think diversity is among our strengths, not our weakness. I think it empowers us, and it may lead us to being anti-racist. I think Justin, where you are appointed, helps the congregation and people in Chapel Hill and friends to move toward being anti-racist.
Thank you for that. And I'd quickly lift up a book, if you've not read it before, United by Faith, the Multiracial Congregation as an Answer to the Problem of Race, by Curtis Paul DeYoung, Michael Emerson, George Yancey, and Karen Chai Kim. It's a book written several years ago, but what they're wrestling with is, how does or can multiculturalism, multiracial church actually help us to achieve a more of an anti-racist posture? And is it possible to create a new culture? I mean, once the collective comes together, is it possible to create a new culture, and what are the challenges to that cultural creation?
I think being uncomfortable with someone of a different race empowers us. I don't think it weakens us. I think the irritation with being uncomfortable can help move us to a more positive place. I heard years ago that, I don't know how true it is, I hadn't proven it, but this is out of the irritation with an oyster comes the pearl.
I wanted to thank Cameron about using the term about particularity, and I think one of the things that I want to just, and at least I want to try to make sure we get to your points too, and feel free to continue this beyond this first series, but one of the things that definitely happens, and I appreciate in that article that I referenced, towards a critical race theory of education, their critique of multiculturalism is that when you're starting to go down the road of race, because multiculturalism and diversity are so intertwined, it's easy to get off track. And like, to Cameron's point, I don't think any one congregation is supposed to be everything, because based upon what I was taught, it's supposed to be a body or a group, right? So everyone has their roles to play, but it's also, clear in just when we think about our local history in particular, because it kind of helps to ground us a little bit. It was the actions of white churches in the past that helped to, I mean, that's why there are Black churches, right? Like, it wasn't because Black people didn't want to be a part of that, right? So it's like, when we just own some of those things, then it's easier for us to kind of get back to how to like undo the things, as opposed to like getting drawn into so many other directions. Whenever it's kind of like a debate, like it's easy to get off topic or to get off into other places whenever we don't stay focused on what the point is. So I think that's what's helpful. Again, if you don't have space to do this, like I don't really do this very often either, to be honest, with such a different group of people. So it's just easy to have, and the resources that Justin mentioned, again, the questions that Rob asked earlier, and Rob, I hope you can listen to what we talked about when you were gone. This is all beneficial, because if you're left to your own devices, we're going to repeat. Again, status quo is very easy to do whenever you continue to conflate terms and you don't parse them out and you don't have the history of the communities in which you're in. And Lisa, the point about Chapel of Durham, I would love to see if Michael or any other local Durhams would love to say anything, Durham folks, to say stuff about that, because I think that's a huge thing that I picked up as a student myself.
One thing I thought about, it's not just Michael Jordan or LeBron James. It's not just pro athletes. It's in local businesses. When local business owners have spoken out, they've been boycotted. Their business revenue has dropped. So it's a cause for people to be silent. And sort of say, well, I'll pray that things get better, but not be in the spotlight, because there's a cost to pay for that. Martin King paid with his life.
I think when we speak of multiculturalism, if I think the thought just occurred, there's somewhat of a hesitancy as it relates to from some of us in the African American community, because it seems like that's a show we've seen before, that we end up giving up more than what is given to us in the process. And so being having a church to meet all needs, that's like a utopia. When you fail to realize that there are some biases that are going to come in. We are African Methodist Episcopal, not because of doctrine, but because of a racial issue. And so that history is there. I think we speak about moving towards multiculturalism, we're going to lose a lot of history that we are just discovering now. And really acknowledging, it's not just discovering, but acknowledging. I think that's the term of acknowledgement. Here in Chapel Hill, from buildings to streets, to the town of Carborough, there's some things that may be swept under the rug, and lost in that process of trying to blend in. There's some piece they call it the Great Blend. I forgot which Black historian stated it, said that they call it the Great Melting Pot, but there are some pieces just don't melt too well. And
to me, it feels a little bit like the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And this country, and certainly our town and region, has a specific thing we got to deal with, which is our history on race, particularly Black race. I think that we also have a big thing to do about Indigenous people, and I wouldn't want that to get swept under the rug with a multicultural. I mean, sure, we want to welcome everybody. The Advocate, we use the sentence, we welcome people of every kind of household and every stage of life and faith and doubt. And I really resisted having a litany within that of who all we welcome. But I'm realizing more and more that we may need to have a particular statement about race. Not that we welcome Black people particularly, but that we realize there's something we've got to deal with here. And I agree with Michael. I wouldn't want the Black history and all of that racism to get mixed up with all the other many beautiful cultures that we want to welcome.
I think one of the great risks that multiculturalism has is it's really another word in many people's minds for assimilation. You're welcome. We're all in support of multiculturalism as long as you're willing to accept our culture. And the same thing risk is carried by the term integration. As long as you're willing to accept the values that one race, that my race has, then yeah, we'll think about bringing you in, but you need to leave some of these other things that you're doing behind. We find them weird or distasteful. And if you want to come into our group, that's fine, but don't wear those funny clothes and wear your hair that way, please.
I think for many of us, our theological streams that we are flowing out of, we deeply emphasize the mystery of the incarnation of Jesus. And I think there's so much power in that mystery because it's powerful and scandalous enough to believe that God would become flesh. But he became that word of particularity. He became a very particular kind of flesh, and that God would intentionally locate himself among one of the most oppressed groups of people in the history of the world at a time when that group of people was under the oppressive reign of the Roman Empire. I think that that's mystery enough to think about God becoming flesh, but to really ponder the type of flesh that he intentionally became. I think that speaks heavily to us right now.
And Matt, I appreciate that. That's, I think, a great way to kind of conclude for now. And again, I really hope we can continue these beyond this initial passage. I think we're all benefiting from this. This last one next week will be on from 2000 forward. And then I think our last one will be the where we all come together and allow the communities of faith to interact if we're able to figure that out technologically. So yeah, thank you all for your time and for this really great, robust conversation.